AI is the best thing that has happened to research in the past 20 years. And it's not for like the tactical reason. Like a lot of the conversation about AI is like how it's going to support the process and stuff. That's interesting. And obviously we're doing a lot of that already on our end and investing there. But what I find interesting is the organizational shift that it's going to introduce.
I'm your host, Enzo, co-founder at June. In this show, I'm talking to the most inspiring product and growth leaders out there who will share their tips on how to launch and grow your SaaS. No fuss, no BS. I hope you enjoyed the show. Hi, Joe, and welcome to the June podcast.
Hey, Enzo, I'm very happy to be here. I'm very, very excited to have this chat.
Oh my God, this voice.
I'm
so charming. Thrilled to have you here. I think you're a rare bird on the show. You're a product and a design person, right?
Yeah, absolutely. My background is I was designing shitty websites for the web when I was 10 years old. I think I've always been passionate about the craft of design and product, and then ultimately what you do with these things, right? I think that I was passionate about everything that you could use to build, and I think it's something that we share as well, like together, where coming from a design and then video game background, like all of these things where you're just trying to play with your craft. And then embarking on the founding journey from there was an interesting shift as well.
We're going to talk about that in a second. I think it's very interesting to see the shift. You started maze.com 5 years ago.
Maze.co, maze.design for a long time. And I think people still remember the maze.design more than they remember the maze.co. We tried to acquire the maze.com, which is a very long story that I'm happy to share at some point. But yeah, maze.co, we founded that 5 years ago with this idea of being able to democratize research. And so for us, we saw an opportunity to say the democratization of research is really about how do you make research accessible for companies of all sizes, in all industries, and more importantly, for anyone within the product organization, right? And so that's what we've tried to build for the past 5 years. And today we're the most used user research platform in the world, which is something that we're celebrating as a company. But more importantly, it shows that our vision and our mission is just at the beginning and at the inception of what we're really trying to achieve, which is making research a standard part of the process for every org.
That's awesome. And you have, how do you define research? Is it user research, or is it like a broader thing in your opinion?
No, it's user research. It's anything that connects with a user and that allow you to get their insight. And so we focus heavily on the data collection piece of the process. The way we think about this is it's almost like a W process where you build things, where you move things on the roadmap, and then ultimately, how do you validate the things that exist between those two things? And so we think of Maze as the validation layer that lives between the building layer and the road mapping layer. And so anything ranging from, is this the right thing to build? And then, is this the right design? And then, is this the right value proposition? And even post-development, is this satisfying for our users? So anything ranging from discovery to usability to satisfaction, we cover it all. There's still a lot more to build.
That's so exciting because you're really challenging the limit of what designs mean. Like, I think in the past, design was static and not developed yet, right? So basically design files. And when you say like post-development, I think it challenges the way we think about what a design means and where can people give feedback. And a couple of weeks ago, there was Ryan Singer on the show, and he shared he has this CSS library which basically allows you to have a prototype which is live but looks like a design, very raw, bare bone.
Yeah, it's super interesting because so before I started Maze, I was again in design and research, and a big part of my life was assessing if we were going to build a prototype or not. Because before the InVision of the world, building a prototype was limited to the companies that had the budget to build HTML and CS prototype to replicate the real thing before actually building it. And so those were the large organizations, right? People forget how much of a disruption InVision brought to the market by making this process something that's actually available to everyone. That was the thing that we built Maze on, right? Like a lot of people ask us, why didn't Maze exist before you actually built it? And the reason was the market was just not there because prototyping was not a democratized process. And we saw that angle on the market, right? That all of a sudden you had something that looked like the real product that was accessible and available to everyone. And that all of a sudden we could provide the same amount of data to people that were building pre-development than you have post development, like the things you're building with June, right? And so the goal is, how can we provide as much data at this stage of the product development process so that people can de-risk their decision? Because ultimately, the cost of wrong today is so high, of being wrong on building the wrong product, building the wrong features, building the wrong design, that those were the costs that we are trying to save for organization, and all of that tied into the continuous product discovery cycle for organizations.
Wow. But are we going, hold on, is it a cycle? Like they were working prototypes and then you started to create prototypes on Figma files, and now we're going back to 101, or
exactly. I think prototyping in itself, so people hate this word, it's fine. I think prototyping is a wasteful process. And what I mean by wasteful is that it's anything that a company creates that doesn't provide value to an end user is a wasteful process, right? In that it's an artifact that exists between the idea to the moment where it provides value for a user. And so there's always questions about, are these artifacts going to exist with us for the next 5, 10, 15 years? And so our role at Maze is building for the way people build today, but also trying to de-risk our position in the market and try to understand how people will build in the future, and hopefully also power some of that, right? Trying to orient the ship in a certain direction. And so for us, we think that potentially prototypes are going to shift, and potentially we're seeing more and more prototype in code. We're seeing Figma now raising their variables and getting closer to coded prototype. We're seeing the prototype of the world and the framework of the world. Even if you think before the prototyping, the design in code with the Webflow and the Wix, where companies are literally just building, right? There's no design and prototyping part of the process. So we have to build for these use cases as well. And we believe that the reality is most of the value in the future lies in your capacity to build, lies in the discovery part of the process. So before you even think about what you're going to build, right? So de-risking that is going to be the most important part of the process.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's one thing that a lot of people say currently with AI. You know, when you have the objection of like, is AI going to replace humans? A lot of the time you hear, well, it's never going to replace the ideation phase, or or making sure that someone supervise AI. And it feels it's almost the same with design, right? There's a lot of steps that might be streamlined, might be automated, might be integrated, but what happens before that will require a human, right? That's your perspective on things?
That's my take. And I have a very contrarian take about this, where I think AI is the best thing that has happened to research in the past 20 years. Because, and it's not for like the tactical reason. Like a lot of the conversation about AI is like how it's going to support the process and stuff. That's interesting. And obviously we're doing a lot of that already on our end and investing there. But what I find interesting is the organizational shift that it's going to introduce. So for the past 20 years, the way that we've built product has been led by this build fast, break things mentality, right? Because the reality was de-risking decision was expensive. And so the easiest way for you to be faster than your competitor was to be faster to market. And so that meant we build fast over building right? We wanted to push things and then see if they were working. And I think what's interesting with AI is that it's going to level the playing field in the capacity for companies to build fast, meaning that all of a sudden your capacity to ship stuff fast disappears when everyone can do it. And so it forces organization then to build right. And building right implies putting the users and ultimately research at the center of the organization. That all of a sudden your time to write, it's something that we are trying to coin, like how fast you can be right compared to your competitors, over how fast you can build something and push it to market, is going to be what matters in the next 5 to 10 years when building product becomes more and more assisted.
And when you talk about the role of AI, do you mean the tools based on AI that we use in our day-to-day? Or do you mean really AI in the products we're building?
The role of AI in the day-to-day tools that we are leveraging. I think people are, my opinion is that people are underestimating how fast, overestimating how fast this shift really happened in the market, right? Like we talked about data-driven 20 years ago. We talked about design transformation 15 years ago. And most organizations still don't have the data maturity, still don't have the design maturity. And so a lot of people think it's about the tools, when really it's about how fast we can mature processes and orgs and things like that. And we won't be there in the next 10 years, but the processes internally will be more and more assisted.
That's also the opinion that Scott Belsky, the VP of product at Adobe, had when he came
Yeah.
on the show, he said that in his opinion, the most critical phase is the exploration when you go broad. And right
Yeah.
now it's a phase that you have to skip because you don't have time. But with AI,
Exactly.
you're able to explore so many directions now that is really
E-
that it's going to give an extra quality output, basically.
Exactly. And something that we're exploring deeply at Maze right now is, for the longest time, there was this, on the exploratory work, there was the challenge between moderated research and unmoderated research, where unmoderated with surveys and tools like that allowed you to have the scale, but moderated allowed you to have the why, right? Like the conversation that we're having right now, we're able, as humans, to basically dig into each other's topic when we find that there's something relevant that we want to discuss. The problem with unmoderated was there was a limitation in unmoderated's capacity to extract the why, because how many times have you reviewed a survey and were like, I wish I could have asked that person that question when they replied that. And so at Maze, we're trying to create a system where we can bring the best of both worlds, where unmoderated and moderated live together, and all of a sudden we can extract the why at scale and accelerate the exploration process by keeping the human at the center of the process as well.
Isn't unmoderated just the future? Like right now, we have to deal with moderated because otherwise we don't get the feedback. But over time, there will be a world with unmoderated feedback. Like, do you think there is an inherent value in moderated that will never disappear?
I think it's still going to be extremely hard to replicate the exact human-to-human interaction. I think that if you speak to researchers, there's a lot of non-spoken clues that you get from conversation with people that are just very hard to extract if you're trying to replicate that in non-moderated setting. And you want that, right? Like you want to create empathy for users, and that's also much harder to create when you're unmoderated. But I think we're going to see a lot of mixes of, like, the line is going to blur between those two practices, right? I think we're going to be more and more assistance in unmoderated with moderator in an unmoderated setting. And that's going to be exciting to try to get more of that data in. But we still will have a need for moderated, I think, in the future. I think it will take a lot of time for technology to get us to a point where we will be able to get those clues that are critical to creating empathy in an unmoderated setting.
Makes total sense to me. Is there another shift happening right now? You talked about several of them already, but is there like one big shift happening right now to most people that needs to be spoken out
One big shift. I
in design
mean,
organization, right?
yeah. I think so. I started my career, I was a web designer, right? So I think people don't really understand how fast these things have moved, right? Like there was no differentiation between UX, UI, no specialization in the design field. For the longest time, design was seen as a nice to have, like people that were adding colors to the things that we were building. And that was basically the job that I had. And we're seeing more and more specialization. And I think what's exciting is seeing like the effort and money that has been invested in educating the world, with McKinsey doing the business value of design, great article if you haven't read it, Envision building the Envision design frontier, and just educating the market on what is the actual ROI of design. And I think what's interesting is for design and for product practices, and it's a big topic for research today, there's this question about how do we better connect design output with business outcome. And now there's the same conversation with product output, and that's, I think it's a big part of what June's trying to solve, right? Like connecting product output with business outcome. And as a company for Maze, a big pillar for us this year and for the next few years is connecting research data with business outcome, right? Because as a practice, we can only exist if we're able to explain how we are literally bringing money to the table. And so that's what's exciting, is that I think design has succeeded in doing that shift, supported by the Figmas of the world and people that were both investing on the education, but also productizing the exposition of value. Meaning Figma was not successful because two designers could move block together in a file. It was successful because all of a sudden you had a CEO in a design file. All of a sudden you had marketing in a design file. So the value of design was exposed broader than the design team. And I think it's our role as design and research and product practitioner to try to replicate that success at scale so that we can expose the value of our practices and how they influence the business outcome. So that's what I'm excited about, because design succeeded. We have now a path forward for how we need to replicate the playbook of design.
That's really exciting. So is your goal to bring the CEO into the user research phase?
So
Ideally,
yes,
one
of
day.
course. I think Yeah, I think research is also very visual and empathetic, right? And I think CEOs love to be able to see their users and see how they react to the things that we build. At Maze, one of the key success moments, like completely that we stumbled upon, right? Like it was not intentional, but I think a lot of the founding journey is shooting arrows and drawing the target around them afterward and saying that was your vision all along. And so for us, we had this data dashboard with like a lot of data, but it was not shared. It was not a public facing document. And what we said at some point was, hey, let's create a report that can be shared with anyone. We built that, like it was a hackathon. We built that in a week. When we released it, we saw that on average, 25 people within an organization were looking at the report. And so all of a sudden we had VPs, we had people outside of the product organization taking a look at the report. And that unlocked a big part of our vision, right? That all of a sudden we wanted for research to be democratized. And the way to do that was bringing more eyeballs on research data and the impact of research data. So yeah, that's exactly what we're trying to replicate.
It's crazy. I've heard so many times these stories of, a feature being built, which is not the main one you would think about, that turn into this massive driver of retention or expansion, or almost like it's pillar within the company over time. It's insane, right? And oftentimes it's not obvious, right? It's nothing you have been thinking about.
It's obvious retrospectively, right? Like when you say to people, they're like, yeah, of course you need a report and you need for it to be shared. But when you think historically about a design file or a research report, you don't think like it was not organic for you to think, hey, actually a CEO could see that, right? So yeah, it's super interesting.
Do you remember exactly what happened when this decision was made? Like, were you in favor and you kind of pushed for it, or you were like kind of against and you had to let it go? How do these features that changed the game that you didn't anticipate come out? Like there are so many times I'm against something and it comes out and it's amazing, and I'm like, just close your mouth, Enzo.
I think for us, so for this specific decision, I remember that we had this challenge. So we always had a challenge at Maze. So the first realization for us was we tried to build originally a tool for researchers, right? It was like, we're going to help the research process. We released the tool to market and 90% of our user base were non-researchers. So we're like, wait. So that started educating the vision. All of a sudden we had designers and product managers and product marketers. And we're like, actually, maybe that's not what we're building. Maybe what we're building is really a platform to help democratize the research process for non-researchers. And so with that conclusion, we had all of this data on the dashboard, right? And so we had this conversation internally about if those people are non-researchers, they also don't really know how to process the data that we're presenting, right? Like they want insights, they don't want data, but also they don't have the know-how on how to process the data and turn it into insight. So can we do a best effort and trend lines to help them just assess this volume of data, understand what the results of their study were? And that was what triggered the report. And so I remember we were a very small team. We were maybe 5 people at the time. And I sat down with Thomas, my co-founder. I was still doing design and I was still doing front-end development at the time. And we sat down and we were like, all right, let's try to build this thing. And we created something that we called the usability score out of this as well, where we try to compute a lot of the data that we're collecting and we say, hey, this is your score. All of that was made up on the spot, right? Like we are making things up. And so no pushback, which pushed that to production. And then all of a sudden we saw this massive influx of people sharing, using, and just excitement about the report. So no, I don't think there's been many more cases of like this being so scrappy, but also so successful. Like the ratio of how much time we've invested to how much success we've had. I think that was the best example. But yeah, there's been many times where we're like, holy shit, like this is actually happening.
That's so cool. I remember seeing one of your slides where you explained the breadth of your product. And if I'm not mistaken, the analysis was an extra side step, right? An extra breadth.
Yeah.
And I think every founder on this planet is afraid to add breadth to their product before PMF, right? Because it's like more things to maintain, more things to, trying more bets. And in that case, it just turned out to be very successful.
Yeah. I agree. It's a very hard bet. You want to have as little surface area as possible because otherwise you introduce too many variables to assess if you're even successful. But I think we were like, so before Maze, I built another company that was not successful. So I also knew what not successful looked like really well. And so that helped a lot in us. Like we are very lucky with Maze in that we are very scrappy in the way that we build the company. When the previous company failed, it was a gaming company, and I'm happy to talk about it as well if that's relevant to the conversation. But
we will talk about it.
we
We will talk about it.
yes. So we started building Maze, and I was like, I have this job right now. I'm leading design and research in different agencies, and I'm interested in building Maze. I was obsessed with the idea of Maze. But I was like, let's try to de-risk it as much as we can. And so my job at the time was I tried to force customers to try out the solution in the agency I was working at. And I was like, hey, we have this new platform. It allows you, but I was never telling them that it was my platform. The goal for me was to get both raw feedback of the value they were getting from the platform, and also to have this actual empathy moment of seeing like, do they understand the value that we provide? And I'll always remember it's part of the origin story of Maze, but this moment we sat down with like this massive client from the agency we had. I cannot legally name the client, but it was a big French bank with a green logo. And we sat down with them. I showed them the result of the study we ran with like 50 people in 2 hours. And they were mind blown. They went to my boss at the time and they said, if this was available last year, we could literally have saved millions of dollars. And I was like, they don't know it's me. They don't know anything. Like there's no reason for them to be so excited about this. And we're like, okay, we want to take the bet. And so we built a V1, we published on Product Hunt, and like all of a sudden we had like, I think we had somewhat of an instant product market fit. Like we saw like the Amazon and the Airbnb and the like all of these companies starting to use the product, and we're like, holy shit, it's happening. And so seeing the contrast between when it was not working with the previous company and us having to pull people in and try to retain people, we were also, that's why we were more comfortable taking risk with the surface area. It's because ultimately we knew we had something that was working, and we wanted for these new personas we were attracting, we wanted something that was working even better for them.
That's fascinating. So we talk about like the epiphany, the ID, right? That came from a pain that you had, a customer that you had from your agency, then the quick and dirty MVP and the launch. And I think you touched on something else which was super interesting earlier when you said we had some early traction, but not from the people we expected, right? So we thought we were going to cater to the user researchers, and then we had PMs and so on. I love this one because it's also what happened to June. We launched for, I would say, product managers most likely, and then we ended up having basically everyone who struggles with product analytics, especially B2B SaaS. We learned after launching that people in B2B SaaS were struggling massively with product analytics, right? Complete randomness and how do you read this one afterward? Like, do you think it's the best way to actually reach your PMF? You launch and then you expect you see what market comes to you, because it would have been a very different product if you had built for user researchers, right?
The best founders I see are the ones that are very agile, not only by the way that they build things, but also that they understand that their vision is still being shaped, right? And that it's good to have a strong vision for what you want, but ultimately your vision is going to be dictated by how the market reacts to stuff. And so the best founder I have are the one that, again, to the analogy of shooting arrows and then drawing targets around them afterward, the best founders know where to draw targets, basically, right? Because you shoot a lot of arrows and then you see what sticks and you say, hey, actually, that was my vision all along. And if I think back on like the story of Maze, we were a tool that needed to figure out how we could become a platform and how we could create a category, right? Like we started with this tool element of we're just going to connect to InVision and allow you to get heat maps on your InVision prototype. And from there, we had to reinvent a category. And I think our strength was leveraging that data and the things that we were learning along the way and making it part of our vision to educate what we were going to build and the category we wanted to create. And so if you look at our deck from 2018 to our deck from 2022, there's a massive difference in the way that we both talk about what we're trying to achieve because we just learned, right? So you need to be in capacity to have a strong opinion, but ultimately understand that this vision can change, just like you, right?
This one is so important. Honestly, if there were one learning I had, it would be this one in the first year. Yeah. It's like, it's so unfair. This phase is so unfair. Like if you throw a little bit too far from the target, or if the target is a bit, wishy-washy, You can iterate forever, or you can just feel you haven't hit the target or you're very far, even though you might be, right? So unfair.
Yeah. And I think that's why it's important to have failed, so that you also understand what failing looks like and feels like. Because otherwise, it's there's this whole culture of resilience in startup that I can talk about for 10 hours. But this whole culture of resilience basically inspires the wrong thing. Like, the resilience is not about digging deeper in the problem you're trying to solve. It's also learning that you need to potentially adapt your vision, try new segments, try new things over forcing your vision to the market, right? So it's very unfair because, again, as you described, right, you push for a single problem that you're trying to solve, and ultimately you realize that you are not solving for the wrong people, and you are not solving the right problem. So yeah, that's what happened for us in the previous startup that we launched.
So let's say there is like a unlimited list of parameters that you need to get right to reach product market fit. What are the, let's say, 2 parameters you absolutely need to get to understand if you're on the right track?
To me, it's that you've identified a segment that's big enough that you can create an actual company within, and then that relates to the problem you're trying to solve, and that there's a strong enough willingness to pay from them. And that's what we tested very early on with Maze, right? Like when I went to my agency and I was trying with customers, we saw like every range of customer was interested in the product. So we're like, okay, so this can solve for the smallest company as much as it can solve for like global 2000. And then it feels like the perception of value is high, which means that the willingness to pay is high. And with those two things, basically you've unlocked yourself a path to be able to becoming a successful business, which is what it's all about at the end of the day, right? Like creating a business that's sustainable. And you can only do that with these 2 variables, in my opinion.
Okay, but it means you built also a product, right?
It means, I mean, you don't have to build to even get there. I've advised companies that do that before they even build anything, right? Like talking to users, understanding how much of a problem you're really solving for them, understanding what is the perceived value. All of that doesn't require a product. It requires rigor in how you run interviews before building something, right? But all of this can be achieved before you actually build anything, I believe. And we've seen example, right? I think, so we are both very familiar with Leeway, for example, and we know that that's the way that Leeway approached the way that they built their company, where they had multiple ideas they were interested in, and then they went to market with those ideas with just literally like mock-ups of what they wanted to build. And their goal was, how do we assess the perception of value that people are getting from this? And they were basically able to kill off 4 out of the 5 things that they were trying to build. And that's a success in itself, right? Imagine if they spent a year building every one of these companies and failing. Like it's incredible. Like it's something that needs to be celebrated when you achieve that.
Yeah, it's very impressive. It's very impressive. I think it tells a lot also about entrepreneurship. Mostly, some people need to be passionate about the topic to work 10 years on it, and some people just can discover, boxes and go with it. Antoine from Leeway is very impressive in that way.
Exactly. I'm all about passion. I think we're the same on that front, where I wouldn't be able to wake up in the morning if I was not passionate about the problem I solved. But I remember in the early days of entrepreneurship, I was meeting with a lot of founders, and I'll always have this memory of going to seed camp and meeting that founder that was in like waste management for construction workers, right? And I was like, do you care? Like you wake up every day, and I'm not saying it's not a great space. I'm saying like you have to really, really care about this space. And he was like, no, I don't care about it. I just think that it's an interesting space and I like solving problems. And I think you really need those 2 types of entrepreneurs in the world because there is a need for waste management for construction workers, and there is a need for product research and analytics. So both of us need to exist in this world, I guess.
What is the main? So before you started Maze and before you work in that design agency, I would say called BAM, right, in Paris.
Yep.
You created Ping with 2J. What was your main learning from Ping? Was it that you need to be passionate about your project to do them, or what?
I mean, I was passionate.
Can you explain what Ping was, maybe?
So Ping was the failed version of Discord, basically. So it's we thought the same problem Discord ultimately solved, which was there is more and more. So I've been a gamer my whole life. I've been gaming my whole life. We saw the same problems, which was there is a world where there's more and more platforms. There's less and less consolidation of platforms, meaning We went from a world where Steam was everything to everyone's creating their own platform. How do you have a friend list that carries over every one of those platforms? And how could you communicate with the people across the platform? And so we believed there needed to be a third party that was going to be the source of truth for your friend list and your communication. That's what we tried to build. So it was a very interesting topic. I loved it. I would never do consumer again, but I loved it. And yeah, we were lucky enough that we were backed day one by Fnatic, which is the biggest and largest pro gaming team in the world. So we felt like that was a bonus, but actually that's probably what killed the company. So it's an interesting story of product market fit, actually, because day one of starting the company, Fnatic was very interested. We had this conversation, and they wanted to invest in the company with the premise of them supporting the launch of the product and then supporting also the collateral and all the social elements. So we're like, all right, we've won, right? Like we won the lottery. That's exactly what we need. So why was it a bad thing?
Solved.
Exactly. So we built the V1 of the product. We presented the V1 to the Fnatic team and they were like, there's not enough features there, right? Like if we're going to engage our brand, you need to build more stuff. And they were very involved in like even the nitpicky details of the platform. That meant that we didn't push the product to market before a year of building stuff internally. So we didn't expose the value. Like we are not able to do research. So what felt like an advantage, like a competitive advantage, turned out to become one of the biggest reasons we failed as a company. Was that if we would have been able to release the product to market, we would have learned that building an app was stupid and that we should have started on web like Discord did. We would have learned that putting a very strong onboarding and a lot of barriers to getting sign up was the wrong part of the process, and we would have done like Discord and built a no sign up flow for people to sign. Like all of the things that I think Discord did extremely well, we were not able to learn because ultimately we were forced to iterate internally before we could actually have Fnatic's approval to release stuff. So that's an interesting example of, I think that's what also motivated us to go so fast to market with Maze, was that we were frustrated for the best part of a year and a half, not being able to iterate. And when the idea of Maze and we started building Maze, I was like, I'm going to expose the shit out of this thing, even if it means that we're manually creating the heat maps. Like, even if it means like we have nothing, I'm going to expose the shit out of it because I want to get feedback fast.
And it's also the philosophy of the product, right? To help people get feedback fast, right? So
it does a meta point. Yeah, exactly. There's a meta point about it. But yeah. What's interesting was that, massive frustration about capacity to execute and iterate that led to Maze. So all of this was ultimately beneficial to the overarching story of like Maze and the narrative of Maze. But it was like we pushed the product to market, no product market fit. Like we were pulling users in. We had the Fnatic support, but it turned out to be less than what we expected as well, which is always the case. We like with partners and with partner play, like you always overinflate what you think it's going to how it's going to impact your company. So we killed the company. And I think the only thing that was really good about Fnatic investing in us was that the CEO of Fnatic was great. And the day he invested, we sat down, and I think it's a very healthy exercise. It's something that I do with some of the companies I advise. And he said, okay, what does failure look like a year from now? And so we sat down and we, instead of saying what the success looked like, we mapped out the 3 or 4 metrics that if we were not able to drive in the next year, would have been like okay, we're killing the company now, right? Or we need to dramatically change the way that we operate. And when we talk about the resilience, I think that was a very healthy exercise in resilience, actually, because it's like, all right, we're going to set boundaries around the experiment that we're running by building this company. And those boundaries are going to be tied to actual real numbers. And so it made the conversation of killing ping very easy. Like a year in, we sat down, we're not nowhere near those numbers. We're also nowhere near product market fit. We've got 500 no's from VCs. So we're in a space right now where either we need to shift dramatically in a world where Discord was starting to exist, or we move on. And we decided to move on, which I'm glad, right? Like I could have spent 6 years or 8 years on this problem. So it's exciting to see that we're able to change entirely.
Great story. I didn't know it. And a lot of learning. I think for me, the main learning is the people you are partnering with in the early days may have a negative impact on your company trajectory.
I think the big learning from so I'm going to say the very cliche thing, but it's fine. Like it's all about the people part of the like. You don't really understand it until you build the company and you have to scale the company and you have to bring in people. Like at the end of the day, it's all the people that are building the company. Like all the software, all the things that you're doing, it's all people behind this. And bringing the right profile versus bringing the wrong profile, bringing someone that's going to be a positive push for the company versus a negative push, like all of that, especially when you're a small company, has dramatic impact. Because if one out of the 10 people in your team are not pushing the company in the right direction, that's 10% of your company that's pushing wrong, right? And that's a lot that you have to fix. So that's the big learning for me. It's being extremely specific about the people that you want to bring in, both internally, externally, right? The VCs that you bring in, and then the employees that you bring in. And I think since then we've done a great job assessing, because we've also seen what it looks like to bring the wrong people.
I wonder how you measure that. How do you know if someone is pushing in the right direction? Let's say, one of the 10 first employees.
I think you build a taste for it, right? Like it's difficult to measure quantitatively. Like I'm not, especially because there's a diversity of roles and a diversity of things that you can measure people against. But there's also a taste of is this person actually contributing to the path that we're trying to create for the organization? Do they have the right DNA for what we're trying to achieve as well? Because I think that often it's more a case of a misfit than someone that's ill-intentioned, right? It's like you don't understand what's required for you at a specific stage and for your specific role. But I think, it's all about building taste. And that's what make multiple time founders so good, is that they've built a very strong taste for what good and what bad looks like.
Very true. And it's really hard to assess this one. And I've seen that many times. So I have to agree with this one. And it's hard because I have a rational mind. So I try to write down what makes a good person to join you, or a good partner, whether it's like, an investor or someone else. But every time I think I nailed the list, there is always something I've missed.
Exactly. I think very much like the vision that we discussed, there is a calibration process as well that you go through every time you try to bring people on board. Where I remember when we hired this extraordinary firm for some of our hiring, and they were like, you're imagine that you're a child and you're going to pick a flavor for the first time, picking ice cream. You don't know what ice cream you like. Like, you think you want vanilla because everyone tells you need vanilla, but the reality is you have to calibrate against the market. You have to calibrate and understand what you need by talking to people. And so that's why having the right support system, being able to have people that have experience that can actually help you calibrate, and help you build taste, is critical. And so that's what the right VCs bring you. That's why the right angels bring you, like just exposing you to, this is what great look like. So now you have the right calibration to know what was great and great for you stage look like. And I think our board, our angels, like all of those help tremendously help me build the taste.
Very interesting. I remember that was an advice you gave me. Whenever you open a role, meet a lot of people to understand what great means. And then you're going to recruit based on what you know is great. You don't always need great. Sometimes great is like too senior or, not what you need for the role, but now you know.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's probably the sentence that I say the most on a daily basis when we're doing hiring, right? It's like, have you met enough people? Have you met enough people to know what we're optimizing for? Have we indexed on the right things? Because ultimately, if it's all about the people, then it's all about the hiring process, right? Like it's a direct correlation one to another, where if you want the right people, you need to make sure that you know how to hire the right people and what you're indexing on.
You talk about Maze as if it was always easy. You talk about almost instant PMF. I want to talk about the hurdles of building Maze. Is there a hard moment you can share with us that you went through? And I'm very keen to hear a bit your thoughts process of how you went through that, how you stayed motivated, how you kept being confident on your vision.
Yeah. I mean, there were multiple difficult moments. I think right now, what we've been building seems obvious, right? Like it needed to happen. But for the longest time, so we were very lucky in the first year that we had almost instant some form of product market fit. We were able to raise very early a pre-seed, like 1 month after we started the company. So we were like, okay, we're on the right trajectory. But then from there, there's the whole delusion of the reality of the market you exist in that start to happen. And so for us, that meant that every conversation we had, before even having to sell Maze, I had to sell that there was going to be a space for research. And that was one of the biggest challenges for the company for the first 3 or 4 years. Like today, research is part of many conversations, and we talk about continuous product discovery and all of these things. But you have to remember that 5 years ago, Figma was not on the map, right? So all of these, like the value of design, the value of research, and the value of product, all of these conversations I basically had to lead with. And that was very, when the conversation you have with investors and with potential prospects are, is there going to be a research space? It's very hard because you're not selling your company. You have first to sell that there's going to be a broader space that can exist. And so we had to push like crazy to get a narrative out that people could relate to. And so I think my role as a CEO was being this storyteller. And I like to talk about a story market fit, right? Where you craft the story about your vision for the space and then you test it out with VCs. And I had to do a lot of that. We took for the seed round, we took so many notes just because of how we framed the market and how we had to explain the market. It forced us internally to have a lot of those conversations. So yeah, that was not an easy journey or path.
Did you feel you were able to shape people mindset, or basically it's your initial success and the Figma success and a couple of thought leaders that had an impact in the end?
So that's an advice I give to founders is we were able to do that the moment we were able to attach the trajectory we are in to the success of another category that we could try to mimic one, right? And so funny enough, you're not going to like this one, but so funny enough, for us, it was talking about the BI teams and the rise of the amplitude and the mixed panel, right? Because what we were saying was it's a very similar space, right? You have small BI teams and you have data requests everywhere. And so as an organization, you can infinitely scale the BI team, or you can put the means of making decisions and collect data in the hands of the people that are making those decisions. And research is very similar to that. So if you believe that BI could change and unlock this massive market, you have to believe that research can change and do the exact same thing. So that when we feel out like that angle, that specific angle, it helped a lot in shaping people's mind, because all of a sudden they could understand the way that we were seeing the market. But it took a lot of iteration, right? Like I can send you 30 different versions of the deck that we had with 30 different stories. So yeah, a lot of iterations.
I really like the idea of like decentralizing from one team or one department to kind of the more operational side of the organization. I think a lot is happening around that, whether it's research, design, product, data. I think that's very true. And just to be clear, like we're super excited about the BIs and the amplitude and the mixed panel. I think similar to you with Figma, I think they've created the market and they've opened the gates to to have a budget for analytics in the product and the engineering department. That's amazing,
Exactly. They've done the education. I mean, we're the same with user testing and the user Zoom of the world, right? Like we're very excited that you're not carrying the cost of education alone, right? And that there's other people with budget that can help you, educate the market, help evangelize.
How hard were these moments? Like, were there any moments like where you thought you were not going to be able to raise and build the company you wanted to build, or it was more like, okay, we're going to be able to do that thing, but it's probably not going to be as big as we want if investors don't follow us?
My profile is I'm an absurd optimist in that you kind of have to be like unrealistically optimistic about everything. So I don't think I've ever been in a mental space where I was like, it's not going to work or it's not going to happen. But so there's this part of you that's very grounded where you're like, holy shit, that's not working right now. But you have to have this other part of yourself that's like, no, but it has to work, right? Like it just has to work and it will work. Because that's also the energy that you want to infuse within your team. So yes, it's been hard, but I don't think I've been in a mental space ever where I was like, it's not going to work or it's not going to happen. I just thought it's going to be hard, and that was it basically.
I know you for some time, and you always seem super chill and casual and optimistic. But I never asked you if there were sacrifices you had to make to build Maze.
I mean, probably yes. So yes, of course. I think the answer to that is going to be a bit mixed, but massive sacrifices of life, right? I think the way that I always thought about entrepreneurship was it's a bet that I'm taking on myself. And I'm willing to put years of effort and energy and mental health and all the things that come with it, right? Like it's all consuming. You cannot have a casual founding experience, especially if you're building a startup that's going to be VC backed. Like it's going to be very like all consuming part of your waking hours and part of the things that you do when you go to sleep at night. So those are the sacrifices. I don't think they're unique to me. I think they're just sacrifices that if you want to build a company, you have to be very aware of. And those things, people fantasize about them, like, oh, I want to be so embedded into passionate about the things that I build. But you have to realize that those things stay with you. I'm 5 years into building Maze. And 5 years in, I go to sleep and I think about the next day, go to market conversation that I need to have and the hiring we need to do a year from now. And like all of these things, they stay with you. So it consumes you very fast. And at some point, the hardest part of the journey just becomes waking up in the morning and doing the thing, right? Like much more than your competitors, much more than building or whatever. It's being there and continuously instilling energy to your team to build stuff. So yeah, those are the sacrifices, I would say, right? But those are sacrifices that knowing myself, I would have done anyway, whatever the trajectory I would have taken, right? I don't know how to do things lightly really well. So it's, yeah. So that's why I don't know if it's a sacrifice more than it's just who I am as a person and how much I want to be invested in the things that I do.
That's a great reflection. And I remember Lenny Rachitsky saying at the meetup that a lot of PMs, product manager, are asking him if they should start a company. And I remember he told them, you should only start a company if you have no choice. If it's so, like the push is so strong that you can't not do it. And that's the only reason you should do it because it's just going to be so hard. And there's so few chances that you make it work that it's not rational. People were asking him like, why don't you stop your newsletter to do like something else? He was like, guys, like I'm writing one newsletter a week and I'm making a living and that's it. Like, why would I start a startup? So I think this answer resonates a lot with what he said.
Exactly. And I think it's a very deep sense of how much you value ambition as well. So for me, for example, I know that I cannot, again, like this thing about taking things lightly, I fully agree with Lenny's point on that, but also when you're seeing something that's successful, you want to make it something massive. And I think that's something that I see in a lot of the very successful founders is ultimately they cannot be content. Like there's a sense of you cannot be content with the things you have and you always want more of what you can have. So that's what I look for also in profiles of founders that I want to advise and I want to work with, is this type of like discontent people that they just want more things.
Yes. And I think that's because of their parents. Thanks the moms and the dads who brought up these kids that are never satisfied.
Amen.
You know, that should be actually a question that you do when you want to invest in a founder. Meet the mom if it's a guy, or meet the dad if it's a woman, and ask them like how they raise their kids. You would learn so much about actually the attitude of the entrepreneurs.
I have a fun story about this so I did some therapy for some time, and I remember one of the first questions my therapist asked me was, who did your parents look up to when you were a child? And I was like, that's a very interesting question, because ultimately who your parents look up to is ultimately what unconsciously you're trying to replicate. And so it's almost a question. So it's a very, it's a very personal question. So I don't want to ask it in an interview, but ultimately I think it tells a lot, right, about the personality that you'll create. Because ultimately my parents were looking up to people that were very ambitious. They were looking up to people. And so ultimately, whether you want it or not, you're very much shaped by a lot of that. So maybe I'll integrate it into the hiring process.
Do it and let me know if you get sued.
Yeah, exactly.
There is one. We've been together for a long time. There are two questions I want to wrap up on with you.
Yes.
Thanks so much for sharing your personal stories, by the way. I really appreciate. The
Of
first
course.
question is the first question is on you moving to the US. So you were based in Europe, I think in Paris, if I'm not mistaken, and you moved to New York. And I think you've seen, I think, very different things there. And I wanted to know if your approach to entrepreneurship has shaped differently since you moved there.
So not really. So I moved to New York because we are a fully remote company. And so for the longest time, I wanted to be in New York because it would allow me to have a better, almost lifestyle living between the Western US and Europe. And so not having to take calls at 10 p.m. every day, basically. That was the thing behind it. That being said, I've had a very close relationship with the US for a very long time because we talked about the struggle of selling the vision of maize and selling the market of maize. And that was a struggle that I had mainly in Europe, right? For the very first, like the first years of maize, I spent a lot of time in Europe trying to educate VCs about our space. And there was just a level of understanding and maturity that was much lower than the first time I actually went to the US and I started speaking about the vision that we had. I felt like it resonated so much deeper than what I have had experienced. And so I think it's just that the US in general are like probably 50 years in advance compared to Europe when it comes to entrepreneurship, in that they've seen the success so many times that it's something that they can replicate, versus in Europe, it's something that's still very ad hoc, right? If you talk to a firm that has a unicorn, they won't really be able to tell you what made them a unicorn. But if you talk to a firm in the US, they're like, yeah, we do them like every year, right? So it's that's what I found. But this has shaped me heavily, but from France, right? Because I had US investors, but I was based in France. So no, now that I'm in the US, I'm just happy that I have a life after 6 p.m. I think that's what changed the most for me since I arrived here, but not my vision of entrepreneurship.
Interesting. So I still have two questions for you because because
Okay.
this one was a no basically. Um, okay, I want to talk about the future. Um, you talk about like how you launched a couple of things in the past, especially some features at Maze. Now you're like pioneering your market, or you're a big fish, right, in your market. You're like Series B,
Hmm.
thriving. The brand is very known. There are a couple of rankings every year. I forgot the name. You're always showing at the top of these rankings, if not at the very top. Again, I forgot about this. Congratulations. How
Thank
do
you.
you keep that? How do you keep that rank? How do you keep innovating in this market, basically? And how do you handle the risk versus the reward? Like, how do you think about innovating now that you're in a leading position?
Yeah, that could be an hour of a question. So I'm going to try to be as concise as we can about answering this. I think I'm very, very supported at this point in the business, right? Like we are more than 120 people at May. So I'm very supported in that it gives me more space time to be able to think about what I think is both the future of our space, the future of our category, and then ultimately the future of how we want to solve for that category. So that's what having also a great management layer unlocks for you, is that your role as a CEO becomes less about the chief everything officer and everything's on fire and you're just dealing with stuff, and having more mental headspace to think about that future and how you want to solve for it. And so your role becomes just giving direction. So for us, for example, it's thinking through how AI is going to change our space and how AI is going to change the research processes, and then thinking through, okay, so if we believe this is what organization will look like 10 years from now, how do we support those organizations when they happen, right? So I think our relationship to risk hasn't really changed, because as a founder, there's a moment. So your $0 to $1 million ARR, your 1 to 10, your 10 to 50, like all of those are graduation moments. And there's a deep sense of what got us here won't get us to the next step. And what that means is probably the team, probably the product, probably the market. So it's like we have to go up market. We have to build a new product line to both support the going up market, but also potentially unlock new ways for us to generate revenue, provide value to users. And then we need to bring experience from people that have seen this 10 to 50 million journey. And so the I don't think of it in terms of like risk reward. I think of it of if we don't change, the risk is not changing. The only path forward is actually continuously changing so that we can serve different users, etc. So I think that's the way that I think about it. And so my role becomes just giving the trend line and the direction, and for the managers to own that direction and transform it into a go-to-market strategy and a product strategy. But I'm less involved in that these days, and I'm more involved in just giving the general direction and ensuring that this message carried over to the rest of the team.
Very interesting. But one thing I've seen, and let me know if it's a mistaken, is that over time the innovation doesn't only happen from the product; it happens from the rest of the organization. So how do we position? How do we sell? How do we go to market? And I think the hard thing
100%.
is to keep innovating on the product and not assuming that you just need to keep it the way it is forever. And because your brain is and your energy is so pulled into these discussions, it's very easy to forget that the product needs to iterate.
Yeah. So it hasn't been announced yet. I don't know when the podcast will be out, but we'll probably have announced it by then. So we just hired our new CPO, who was the VP product at Dropbox and the VP product at Instacart. Incredible hire. We're very happy. It took me just a year and a half to hire that person. So and so we have this conversation about innovation, and more than innovation, the portfolio of investment that you want to make, and how do you assess what is a 3 months, what is a 1 year, what is a 5 year bet that you want to make, and how do you assess how you sprinkle your resources on that. And for example, this market that's very constrained, where every quarter matters because it's a market where just revenue is harder to generate, forces the product strategy to be 90% in the 3 months and 10% in the 5 years and the 1 year strategy, right? Because the reality is you're very constrained as a company to have to generate revenue for a quarter over quarter, compared to a market where money is more available and you can take larger bets and invest more of the resources that you have against those bets. So for us, that's the way that we assess things right now. It's how many resources do we want to invest in bets from a product strategy perspective, from a go-to-market strategy perspective, and we only invest in the ones that we think will have an up, like a 100x multiple upside if they are successful.
Lovely. Okay. So you're juicing the market, kind of juicing the market where you already have PMF, and then you're investing 10%, 20%, 30% of the resources into unlocking the next step. You know it's necessary, but you don't want to lean too heavily because it would be too risky.
Exactly. And I think, again, like exactly what you described, there's an innovation part of the product. We're going to build net new things that are going to provide net new value. But ultimately, there's also, you have innovation on your go-to-market where you're now solving for the enterprise, and enterprise have different needs, and you need to support that as well. And so product needs to support the different innovation that are happening across your organization. So it's not just about how are we going to create net new products, it's also how are we going to create net new things that are going to support the new go-to-market as well, that's going to unlock the business. So balancing that is a matter of what the business needs ultimately and how much leeway you have as an organization.
And that is super clear in your head. Like right now, top of your mind, you could almost tell me how many people or how many projects are, in this area versus another, right? Like that's top of mind for you.
Yeah, especially because we did a product offsite in New York 2 weeks ago, where we literally just decided what we were going to support and not, and the things that we wanted to continue investing in, and the net new thing we think are the right bets. So it's literally a work that we did 2 weeks ago again. So yeah, super clear.
Awesome. Last question, 10 seconds. I think we're going to cut this one, but I will ask it anyway. Why?
All right, let's do it.
Why haven't you sold Maze to Figma? And and why aren't you guys growing through acquisition yourself?
So I'll give you the politically correct answer to that, because that's actually the answer that I give internally. Ultimately, my goal is to bring the vision of Maze to life, right? I'm not against acquisition. I'm not against for us to get acquired. Ultimately, like the straightest path to get there, for our perspective today, is continuously building the company that we want to become, becoming an iconic company, becoming a public company, if at some point in this journey, there's an opportunity for us to accelerate our vision to market through an acquisition, both us acquiring someone or us getting acquired, I'll always consider it, right? I think that people underestimate how much the job as the CEO at some point just becomes building relationship, building partnership with the right people, so that you always have a portfolio of options that you're exploring as an organization. And so that's the job. But so right now, there hasn't been an opportunity that I felt was compelling enough for us to either acquire someone, and we've explored that many times, or for us to be acquired, which we've also talked about at some point. Is that
I love
satisfying?
the politically correct. It's very satisfying. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Yes.
I could talk with you for hours. I have a lot of other stuff, but I think it's been a great chat so far. So let's wrap it up. Thank you so much for coming. I really loved the chat.
Yeah, thanks so much, Enzo. It was really fun. I hope people will enjoy the episode, and thank you. I'll be back on the podcast soon. I hope.
For sure, you will be the first one to come 2 times. Where can people find you if they want to engage with you?
Yeah, so LinkedIn and Twitter. My last name is a nightmare, so we'll probably want to share a link somewhere. But yeah, those are the 2 places where I'm the most, where I respond the fastest. So if you want to reach out, feel free to reach out. We're also doing a lot of work on AI, and we're inviting people to a private beta. We just announced it yesterday. So if you want to be part of that beta, we're more than happy to have you there. So yeah. Exactly. So keep in touch. I'm available on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Awesome. I will make sure to link to your profiles in the description.
Awesome.
Thanks again, Joe. Have a good one. Talk soon.
Have a good one. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to the June podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a 5-star rating and subscribe. This episode is powered by June. For a better way to do product analytics, visit june.so.